I was looking out and I was feeling very overwhelmed by the idea of the state of the world and how can we destroy this? How can we destroy all this beauty? How can we be so blind and not care? And, that kind of mood. And the land was like, don't be sad. Don't be sad. The seeds that are creating the dream of this place are intact. And over time, they will just come back. Don't worry about it.
Welcome to the Garrison Institute podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute. Today, we're exploring the world of plants and what they can teach us about intelligence, community, and our place in the web of life. Our guest is Dr. Monica Gagliano. She's pioneered the field of plant bioacoustics, demonstrating that plants not only emit their own voices, but can detect and respond to sounds in their environment, fundamentally expanding our understanding of the pervasiveness of intelligence and consciousness. She is the author of influential books, including Thus Spoke the Plant, and the co-editor of The Mind of Plants. She has been recognized as one of Biohabitat's 24 most inspiring women of ecology, alongside Jane Goodall and Rachel Carson. Join us as we discuss plant communication, interconnectedness of all life, and how recognizing plant sentience could reshape our vision of the common good. Welcome, Monica. You've been in Australia. I've met you in New York and at the Garrison Institute. You've been in the Dolomites looking and listening to the community of trees. You've been in Peru and in South America and Brazil. Where are you now?
Hello, Jonathan. So good to see you again and to be here. Here right now is actually Harvard University. So I'm in the US. I'm a scholar in residence at the Center for the Study of World Religions within Harvard Divinity School. And I'm here as part of the Center's Thinking with Plants and Fungi initiative. We'll have actually a conference coming soon with lots of very interesting people joining. And the Center has had a long interest in engaging with issues related to matter, spirit, ecology, and of course the modern human. And that, I guess, is they're trying to look at these issues in an interdisciplinary way. So it's very exciting to be here.
Well, fantastic. But this is an evolution for you. So let's start at the beginning, and then we're going to get to the work that you're doing now.
Okay.
So you began actually working with fish.
I do.
Okay. But I want to even go back earlier because you were born in Italy, right?
Yep.
And you ended up in Australia. How'd you end up in Australia?
Yeah, I was in Italy. I was born in Italy, in northern Italy, far away from the ocean or far away from the sea in general. And since I was a child, I was totally afraid of the sea and yet totally drawn to it. And so there was this push and pull, I guess, of a love affair with the ocean and the water. And then it was very clear to me that that's where I wanted to work. And eventually, once I finished high school, basically, I applied to go and study marine science. And at the time, there was no such a thing in Italy. You had to do generic biology, but I didn't want to study anything else except the ocean. So I ended up actually in the UK. And I did my undergrads and my master degrees up in Wales first and then Scotland later. And then when I finished my master degree, I just assumed that people with PhDs are people that are very smart. And I'm not particularly smart, so PhD is no material for me. But I loved being in the field and doing the thing. So I was the perfect research assistant, basically. So I went and spent some time in New Zealand in one of the big labs there where the first marine protected area in the world had been established in the North Island of New Zealand. And then after that, I went to work in the Canary Islands and learn Spanish, which of course it would become very useful much later, but at the time I didn't know. And while I was there, actually, I was helping in the field and helping in the lab. other students who were doing their PhDs. And I thought, actually, this is not that hard. Like I would be stupid if I wasn't even trying. And so, of course, this is part of my attitude. It's like, okay, so I'll apply to the best possible place in the world for what I want to do. And then they will say no. And at least I can feel that I tried, and then I can move on. And so, of course, I applied to 2 places. One was San Diego, the Scripps, because for temperate water at the time, it was the best place in the world. And the other one was James Cook University on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, because, of course, for tropical marine science, that was the best place in the world. And Australia said yes. So I was like, perfect. Actually, it's much better in terms of temperature because I don't do very well in the cold. And I thought, okay, we are going to Australia. And once I arrived, I think after traveling for a long time in my life, living in many places, Australia, the land and the waters and the place, I don't know, it really spoke to me. I just felt it under my feet. I was like, I'm at home. And so I've been there, that's my home. And then I've been there on and off because I travel a lot, but that is my home. And I'm there to stay, hopefully.
And you were doing this wonderful work on the reef with fish. And there was a moment then where you were asked to dissect the fish and you realized that they were deeply sentient beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of those points in one's career or life in general that, we call turning points or the beginning of the hero's journey, depending on how we want to see it. And, there is this call for adventure, but first something needs to break. And for me, that was what happened with my fish, because I loved working on the Great Barrier Reef. I was in the water for my work. I was in the water all day, every day for months. And my field trips were long during the summer and long days. And so you're really becoming intimate with the animals there and with the environment itself, with the space. And so you know that you need to turn at that next coral that sticks out, like you know it as you would know, like when you walk on a path in a forest every day. And so it was very familiar, was very intimate, and same was the relationship with the fish. These were wild animals that I was working with who, of course, had their own little niches and their own little places, and I would see them every day. And during that time, I was just observing. So I think I realized only later that they knew that I was just observing and that I was just benign. There was nothing going on with Monica, to the point that some of them actually approached me during the time that we were doing the experiments, and literally they would sit in my hands. These are wild animals. And I was like, wow. And then the other side of me, so the part that was trained to be the scientist in a Western context that demands certain things, at the end of the experiment, needed to collect these fish because my science demanded that I validate what I observe behaviorally with, chemistry and, all sorts of biochemical assays. And so for that work, you need to have body parts, liver, brains, hearts. And the day when was the last day of the experiment, I knew that I needed to go and collect them all. But after so many months together every day in this intimacy, I just felt I really needed to say goodbye before barging in and collecting everything. And certainly the last thing I expected was for them to actually refuse this last encounter, basically. And they were all hiding, and it was heartbreaking for me. I realized, oh my God, they know exactly what's in my head or in my heart right now. And even if there was nothing outside that was giving me away, it's not that I had nets and things to collect them. There was something inside that was obviously emanating a message that they got very loud and clear. And they were like, today, Monica is not the same Monica that we met. And in a way, she has already betrayed that intimacy, so we're not coming out. I felt completely frozen. And I learned a very good lesson that when we are placed in situation where, different worldview collapse onto each other, and there is a point of choice, you have to make a choice, and you feel frozen because you know that the choice you have to make is actually contradicting a new system of value that is arriving for you. So there was guilt, which freezes you completely. And I walked out, I swam out of the water and I went back in the afternoon. And that's what I guess we do in situations like this. When we position in front of these dilemmas, we can only do what we already know. We tend to go back to what it's already familiar. And so for me, the familiar was like, well, I have my ethics approval. This is how science is done. I have to get this fish because otherwise my entire experiment cannot be finished. And, what am I going to do? So I went in and they fought for their life. I fought for my data. I collected all my fish. And that was the last time. And what I learned is first of all, the message that I kept receiving while I was doing this collection was like, you have no right to do this. And actually, you have no right to do this to anyone, not just in this specific case with the fish, but it's like you have no right to take anybody's life in no circumstances. And so, I became vegetarian immediately after. It was a no-brainer, but it was a kind of like, okay, this is my compromise. I don't know how to deal with this. And then, eventually, I shifted completely my science because it became very clear that the kind of questions that I wanted to ask demanded a sacrifice that I wasn't prepared to make anymore. And it wasn't my sacrifice, it was someone else's as well. So I shifted and started working with plants instead. Totally unexpected. And, I was totally plant blind. That's why I got interested in the topic. And I was like, oh, wow, there is even a name for this. But I had to thank my fish for the lesson.
In many indigenous cultures, there's the phrase they refer to the rest of the world as all my relations.
Mm-hmm.
They often refer in American indigenous cultures to the bear as big brother and the beaver as little brother. But they see everything as deeply interrelated. And this was your gateway to that.
Mm-hmm.
There are many wonderful things about Western science, but Western science is designed in many ways. But the predominant way is that it analyzes by disintegrating the depth of deep interrelationship.
That's right.
And so we're going to get back to that. But so then you started working with plants. And even those, you were working with plants as individuals rather than as communities. And you were actually separating them from community in some ways. So talk about that.
Yeah, I was a field ecologist. So during my time as a marine scientist, I've always worked in the ocean where the others live and, where their communities are. And when I moved on to plants, it became very clear that the kind of question that I wanted to ask, which were actually the same question that I was already asking in the context of the animal science, they were in a way so outrageous that I couldn't just go and do a field experiment. I needed to go back almost to the basic of what our modern Western science demands. So I needed to really set the foundation for the question that I wanted to ask. For example, the first experiment I did was with looking at communication between different species. In this case, I had a fennel plant, basil, and chili plants. And the reason why these plants is because they were in my garden. And they're like, well, that will do. I don't know anything about plants. I don't know, which one would be most appropriate. They seemed like appropriate to me. And of course, these particular plants are also known in the more alternative, I guess, way of planting in gardens and farming. They're companion plants or not so good companions. And so that idea really enticed me because it's like, okay, I don't know if this is true, but there must be something about these plants that they can maybe share or not share that identify them as companion with each other or not so good companions. And so I started this, it was my first experiment with plants. And of course, I had to do it in the lab because I wanted to see whether lots of things were, converging at the time. I had done my first trip to Peru because I wanted to understand what I read in some of the anthropological reports about indigenous people in the Amazon talking to plants. Or even more, like learning from the plants and then singing their songs. And I'm like, what does that mean? And so I was like, oh, that's right. Like if you look at the time, if you looked in the literature for plants, there was nothing about sound. Like there was already some literature, beautiful work done on the communication between plants using chemistry, using even light, but nothing on sound. And yet coming from an animal perspective is like, it's all about sound. Everyone, including us, of course, are very noisy. And so I was like, how can it be possible that there is nothing on plants? There was something, of course, there was old stuff from the 60s, which were already like put in the basket of like pseudoscience, crazy science, whatever science. And so in fact, that work in a way, or those questions, nobody wanted to touch them precisely because there was this luggage, and nobody wanted to be labeled like, oh, you're just another of those pseudoscientists. So, or those hippies or whatever, because the music of plants or, This is not what I was doing. This literally I wanted to see if I cut off all the cues that we know plants already use. For example, we knew light, we knew chemistry, we knew touch as well, especially at the root level. Well, if these are really the only ways in which plants can communicate, then there will be nothing happening. If I block everything, nothing will happen. However, if something does happen, and if they still know who is sitting next to them, and depending on their relationship as companion or not, then we should be able to see something. And if something is happening, sound could be one of the ways in which this communication is being activated. It's not the only answer, of course, but it could be one of them. And so, of course, I ran the experiment and with crazy designs of boxes, matryoshka boxes, basically, of with plants inside, so that I could alternatively cut off only the chemistry or only the light or all of it. And of course, the plants still knew exactly what was going on. So I was like, oh no. Oh no, yes, it's clearly they are communicating beyond the means that we know of. So this means that now I have an excuse to explore further. I have an excuse to explore, for example, sound. Then, I explored. And the thing is, as you know, sometimes when you look, you find with other colleagues as well, I started looking into, okay, what would be the role of sound? Would the plants emit their own sound? Would they be listening to the sound in their environment? If they do, what does it mean to them? What do they do? And of course, to all of those answers, which is now over 10 years ago, but now we have several labs around the world specialized on plant bioacoustics. At the time, it was like, she's crazy. But, I actually had this feeling, my job as a scientist to look at this question from the specific lens. But, for people in various places in the world, indigenous people who have been doing this for a long time, and it works. For them, in their context, it works. We're not stupid to do things that don't work. I think we are a relatively lazy species. If something doesn't work, we just drop it. So for something to persist and be so embedded in the culture and so useful, obviously, in the context of that culture, there must be something in there that needs to be explored. So for me, I wasn't trying to validate indigenous knowledge, but it felt almost like a wink. Is I knew you were right. And now at least we can talk about it as well in this world, in the Western world, where otherwise they wouldn't want to hear. So science played that role, basically.
Just to give our audience an example, if you have a particular plant that is pollinated by a particular bee, you can play them dozens of bee sounds and it won't respond. But when you play the sound of that particular bee, it opens up or it shifts towards the sound or whatever.
It produces more sugar to be more attractive.
Right. So the key is actually the plant is discerning.
Yep.
Making a discerning amongst many things, choosing one. And this tells us then that the plant not only has discernment and then reacting and making an adjustment, that actually has intentionality, that it has memory, because these are all qualities of consciousness. And it also has relationality, because what your work and the work of others, such as Susan Simard, have shown is how deeply interconnected all the plants are, continuously communicating through these other, not just sound, but through these other mechanisms too.
Yep.
And so the whole of nature is actually a vibrant, continuously responding, learning, reacting realm of consciousness. So your work began to open that up to you. So take us through that journey and some of the revelations that you learned.
Well, as you know, like some of the experiments, the next step, it was like, okay, you got all of this information that, of course, you know how to communicate. But what is the purpose of sharing information if the other can't remember it, or if you can't remember it, or if you don't learn from it, and like every time you need to start from scratch? And of course, the system doesn't work like that. There is memory in the system. There is learning, of course, because it's part of the memory and learning process. And that guides decision making. So all of the choices, all of the opportunities, all of the I'll do this and I don't do that. And so I did several experiments. One of the famous one is the one with the mimosa, which was the first one that demonstrated, this plant can remember and learn from its own personal experience. And I say personal as not necessarily as a provocation, but like plants are persons of a different kind.
So do you want to just briefly describe the mimosa experiment so people get the sense of plant adapting and learning?
Yeah, so for example, with mimosa was the first experiment to demonstrate that plants can learn and have memory, like we would define that is not a genetic memory because someone passed it on to you from previous times, but because of your own individual experience. So in the case of mimosa, poor little plants, I created this contraption that allowed me to drop them, literally, but no plants got hurt in the process, I know that. And the drop was very small, but it was enough to startle them, basically. And this is a plant, for those who are not familiar with mimosa, is also known as the shy plants or don't touch me plant. And it's one of those plants that when you actually touch the leaves, it folds it and closes the leaves. And if he's really, really disturbed, he even flops down and he looks dead. So he plays dead. And of course, these are all defensive mechanisms for the plant and to look less appetizing for a potential predator. But in nature, clearly, they don't get dropped. And that was exactly why I chose that way of doing the experiment, so that it wasn't something that the plants have had an experience before. It was something totally irrelevant to the plant's life. So there was no possibility for a genetic coding already present. So the only way in which the plant was then able to stop reacting to something like that, which was a bit scary maybe at the beginning, but then it had no consequences. So it was no point of responding constantly to it and wasting lots of energy in the process, was only if he was able to learn on the spot. And that's exactly what they do, and they do it very fast, actually. So I was dropping them, and in my design, based on the design that was used for animals, I had like, I'm going to drop them 60 times consecutively, and then I'll do it again. And, after the first few drops, the plants was already like, oh dear, I don't need to close my leaves. It costs me lots of energy to open and close. And there is actually nothing happening. It's just annoying because this woman keeps dropping me, but it's actually nothing is happening here. And so after a few drops where the plant closes the leaves, then I keep dropping and the plant start reopening the leaves. And then it doesn't close them anymore. And of course, at that point, the scientist in me is like, okay, maybe I exhausted the plant physiologically. That's why it's not moving. But then there are tests that you do to check that what's happening is actually learning and not just physiological exhaustion. And so you do the same test, but instead of a drop, it needs to be another kind of stimulus of the same kind. So in this case, it was a mechanical stimulus. So it needs to be a mechanical stimulus, but not the same. So instead of dropping it, I was shaking them on a shaker plate from chemistry labs. Very briefly as well, because otherwise the plant might learn that too. And of course, the plant reacted immediately. So that told me that it wasn't exhaustion. The plant knew exactly what it was doing. It just realized, okay, there is nothing happening here. I don't need to protect myself. It's just annoying, but it will pass. But when the new stimulus come in, and the plant has never had the experience of this one, then the learning needs to occur yet. And so, of course, the first and the appropriate reaction is to protect yourself. So the plant closes the leaves. And then you test it again on the original stimulus, which is the drop. And of course, the plant's like, oh, but this one I know. And so on the second time around, when you test them again, the plants don't even bother closing the leaves. It's just, I know this one I already got it. And the incredible thing about this is like I repeated the experiment or the test several times over time as well. Initially, I thought I give them 3 days. And then I give them 6 days. I give them 28 days. And the plants still remember exactly, the learning happened. The memory was consolidated to the point that the plant was like, I know this, and I'm not wasting my energy responding to something that is totally nothing. I suspect that they would probably have, remembered for much longer. It's just that I ran out of time in the lab. So the experiment stopped there. But 28 days is already a long time. When we talk about long-term memory for other systems, we're talking about like for bees, for example, which are very smart. We know that they remember and learn fast and a lot. 48 hours would be already a long-term memory. We're talking about 28 days. And it would be the equivalent of asking, like, what did you eat 28 days ago? It's like, I don't know.
So this is really amazing work, because what you're showing, again, you're showing that we don't know the mechanisms, but we know the reality.
Mm.
That plants have memories, that plants have consciousness, that plants can make decisions about it. They can make judgments. So I want to talk about some of the implications of this.
Mm-hmm.
There is an artist named James Bridle, and he said that everything is equally evolved. So if you think about it, there was the Big Bang that happened 13.8 billion years ago. So we have this myth that humans are the crown of creation and we're the top of the evolutionary chain. But in fact, we're all 13.8 billion years. By the way, the rocks are 13.8 billion years ago. Every molecule of water goes back to 13.8 billion years. And obviously all the plants do. And we all fit together in this magnificent interdependent thing of life in which every element is equally evolved, every element is equally old, every element has fit together in this magnificent unfolding. And now what you're saying is, and every element is conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you want to talk a little bit about how you came to viscerally experience that?
I'm a human being before I am a scientist. And the scientist is only the curious part of my humanness. And yet the scientists also drive some of that curiosity into the human experience and exploring all sorts of spaces which are not necessarily what the science want to explore into, or is becoming a little bit more recently, but it wasn't necessarily that. Other states of consciousness, other states of being, which I find, at least from my experience from, Vipassana meditation to shamanic drumming, to work with psychedelic plants, to deep martial arts, yoga, all things that I have done and I consider like my practices. Meditation being fundamental, I think, for anybody. These are also scientific explorations, and what happened for me is like that they became fundamental to inform my science as the scientist in academia. Of course, being very aware of the status quo of Western science, at least, until 10 years ago, is changing very rapidly, maybe not rapidly enough. This kind of conversation of like, so I went and, I did this practice in the Amazon and the plants, this is a practice that is being used for millennia and is designed to enter in conversation and dialogue with the modern human world. That's what it is. It's a technology. And so I went with the specialists of that field, the experts, and they show me how to do it. I did the practice with the guidance and I got the information. And then I come back and in my lab, I can follow the instructions and do an experiment. And look what, the experiment actually works and it's crazy and it finds things that probably I wouldn't even question unless I was shown something else. I think this approach, I didn't share that part of me for a long time because I didn't want my colleagues to judge me. I didn't want my science to be judged, although I got judged anyway. And so by the end of it, it's like, if you're going to judge, then you need to know everything. And if you're going to judge, then I want you to actually have the same experiences because otherwise you don't have the right to judge for something that you do not know. So, like a lot of colleagues still, like they have called me all sorts of names. I think one of the insults would be to call me an animist. But actually, I take that as like, I think that's pretty appropriate. Because fundamentally, it means that everything is alive. And it's true. And in my experience, that's what life is. And so why should I do a science that doesn't reflect that aliveness that I'm exploring?
So it's not just that it's alive, that it's conscious.
Yeah.
I want to take you a little bit, Bo, into the evolution of the science, which is that in the social sciences now, there's a whole philosophy that you need to include for humans in the questions. For example, when you're going to a community and doing research, you need to understand they're co-creators of the questions and the answers. The anthropology a lot has not done is this removed visiting, but it's the recognition of a relationship. In quantum science, we now understand that everything is deeply interconnected, including the observer changes the observation. And so this is, I think, so all-pervasive that it actually shows how reactionary, the science that hasn't gotten this yet is actually, kind of 19th century science.
It is. And I guess the scary bit would be that suddenly you can't just play God and play the detached observer. You had to get dirty. You had to get into it because you're already in it. You're already in that dialogue, in that exchange every time, even if you're in your mind, you're telling yourself the story that you are the detached observer. There is no such a thing.
Right.
That is a myth. And the thing is, what we found as well, talking to some other colleagues who are already taking similar steps, is like, you actually do poor science. So it's not actually embracing the empathic side of ourselves and including the subjectivity of ourselves in the studies, whether it's anthropology or like biological sciences that look at animals, plants, and whatever else, fungi. Embracing that and including it, a knowledge that is present, is actually very scientific. It's like you're not just throwing the data because they're uncomfortable. You say, no, this piece of data is there. I need to take account of it because otherwise it might influence what I'm seeing and I'm not counting for it. So then what you find is that when you are actually acknowledging, I'm a subject in this space. I am part of the experiment. I'm not doing the experiment. I am the experiment with everyone else. Then you're also allowing yourself to see things that potentially you would ignore. And this has happened to me many times now.
But it's happened to everybody. And any science that isolates does that. But also, I want to point out to two things that happened about 100 years ago. So, Heisenberg came up with the uncertainty principle, which is actually recognizing things are not objects, they're parts of relational fields. Mm-hmm. And about 5 years later, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, a great ecologist, went to Ladakh in the Himalayas. And it took me a while to kind of put these things together to realize how much Buddhism must have affected his sense that everything, again, that there are these trophic levels, but he saw that, again, that ecosystems were nested fields of deep relationality. So science has had these on both the ecological and the physics side of it for 100 years.
Yeah.
And yet we've been ignoring that. So every time we do an experiment, as you had to do, where you put a plant in its own little cage and isolate it from sound and chemical signals to try and see one function of it, we're actually disaggregating something that's deeply interconnected.
That's right.
And so now, and by the way, there are all these indigenous traditions which have been looking at an interdependent world and understanding an interdependent world for a very long time. So how does this tell us that going forward, we should actually be doing our science?
Well, science needs to look very different.
So you most recently published a paper, you with co-authors, which was about how a community of trees were communicating electrically with each other, and how they actually perceived an eclipse, which is something that many species respond to, but we didn't know the trees did. Do you feel that experiment began to look at deep relationality?
Yeah, in fact, I think the power of that experiment was that we were able to have the support of the physics. Basically, this happened in the Dolomites. One of my colleagues created this system where we was able to connect and be able to monitor live and in real time individual trees for their bioelectrical activity. It's actually called electron because it's like the genome is a summary of bioelectrical activities, so it's not a specific one. But it's a good proxy for all sorts of physiological processes and all sorts of long distance potential signaling, which of course is the basis for communication. And what was interesting about this experiment is that basically it wasn't designed to test the eclipse. Of course, the eclipse just like, oh, there is an eclipse coming and we have all our apparatus up and running. So why don't we look at the data for that? So of course we had a long baseline for like what's happening in a normal day-to-day life of this forest. And then the eclipse comes.
So the baseline data you're showing the sun rises and the trees start doing some things, and then there's wind and they do some other things, and then the sun sets and they have these daily rhythms
that are very predictable. Yeah.
Right. But they're communicating with each other, and they're intentional rhythms because as things change, the rhythms are showing to change.
Yeah. But the question here, or the important point here, is that this variability is actually very predictable. And it's kind of like, less than 1 in terms of deviation from like a baseline.
Right.
So it's very small. It's like, when it's sunrise, you can tell, oh, this is the signature for sunrise. It might change a little bit between individuals, but it's more or less the signature for sunrise. Oh, when it's sunset, yeah, you can tell. And so it was very predictable.
So the trees were like the guy who goes to work every day. He gets up
exactly.
at the time, he has his coffee, he gets on a train.
That's right. And it's very predictable. Exactly.
Okay.
Then something unexpected, or from our perspective as humans, rare. From the perspective of the tree, this might not be a rare event, but the eclipse arrives. This was a partial solar eclipse, and we had several elements that occurred that were like, oh, wow. And this is thanks to the physics as well that we were able to see it.
So not trees. So normally with humans in non-Western traditions, how have humans responded to eclipses?
Well, we aggregate. But like we've seen it many times, like we tend to all go to a place. And in this case, we want to watch the eclipse. But there are historical records that actually point to the fact that eclipses were able to stop wars.
Right. So there's a thing where people synchronize with eclipses.
Yeah, activities. Yeah. And we see this in animals as well. Yeah.
Like whole forests of birds become silent.
Yeah. Or they all flock, or yeah.
Yeah. So there seems to be, in much of nature, this universal response that went of almost reverence, entering into more contemplative mode of integrating that happens when an eclipse happens.
Or also, we should acknowledge that it could be a very scary thing. The sun goes away, and it's going away in a time which is not normal, if it does it during the day. And so it can be like very disorientating. And so it makes sense that you would join forces and stay close to your peers instead of finding yourself alone. And so that those tendency of congregating and doing the same, it's also like protecting, the self and in the group. So the thing is with this forest, the first amazing thing that we saw was anticipation. So it's not just like, oh, isn't it great? The tree synchronized. No. Before they synchronized, there was a behavior that we would define in animals as anticipation. And we saw it through the physics because anticipation basically is organization of the system. So in terms of entropy, so energy moving, the entropy is very low because you're trying to organize the thing. So it's almost like the equivalent of like, oh, everyone shut up, because we need to decide what's going to happen. So there is this almost like a pause where the system becomes more structured because and less random because it needs to work out what's happening. And we see this in the physics. And so there was anticipation. The anticipation that we recorded was like for the older trees up to 14 hours. That means that the sun is not even close to Italy. Italy is in the middle of their night, and the sun is actually in Australia or thereabout. And yet the old trees from that forest can detect something that is giving them the clue of what's coming. And they start that process of like, okay, let's lower the entropy. Let's organize the system. Something is arriving. Then there is the moment of where this collective system actually transition from that state of like anticipating to acting. And so they enter into a synchronized state. So we see the signature from the bioelectrical readings where all of the trees start doing the same thing. There is one signature. So in a way, we were looking at individual trees a moment before, and now we're looking at the forest as one entity, one integrated system. And in these cases, in a synchronized state, you have an entropy flow. So the entropy or the movement, the chaos is not stable, low, structured. It's moving. When we think of entropy, I think most of us would think like disorder, right? High entropy is like disorder. And it is there, but in living systems, it's not just disorder. It means flow, which means that this is how information is being passed through, the storage, the processing, the use of this information is happening at that stage. So during that moment of synchronization, there is a lot of information being moved around to coordinate basically this state, which I think is amazing. And in fact, as we were saying before, on an everyday kind of mood, the forest is on this level, our baseline, and the deviation from that level is in the order of 1. Well, the deviation during the synchronized state is in the order of 10. So it's 10 times more variable. And so all of that information and that energy moving and transferring, they're not during everyday business as usual. And then, of course, all the trees were the one that maintained the lowest internal entropy, which meant that they were holding the memory. And so that information was stored. And then, of course, once the event is over, the system returned to the baseline. I'm actually quite speechless. When we saw the data the first time, we were like, this is not possible. Like, are we actually watching? Because basically that was recorded in real time. So it's like, are we actually seeing what the forest is literally doing? And I'm saying energetically speaking, because we're talking about physics and entropy. This system is a living system where we are watching what energy does as it passes through in response to an event that is, in this case, a celestial event. So the connection also planetary between what's happening on Earth and what's happening in the rest of the universe is not trivial. It's like here we have two big bodies in the sky, the moon and the sun, which when they find themselves aligned as they do in this kind of eclipse, their power of gravity, it's enormous. So we just need to think that the moon alone during the tidal rhythms, it can move oceans. But when the moon and the sun are together, you have maximum gravitational pull. Trees that are full of water would have a very good sense of that signal. And we proposed that this is what gave the eclipse away. And that's how all the trees who have experienced that before and had the memory stored in that system would know like, there is a change in the gravimetric waves. We need to start preparing. I know what's coming. And I was actually talking to Marcelo Gnese, who you know is an astrophysicist, and I was describing what we were doing and what we found. And I didn't tell him what the cue that we were thinking might be. And he was the one that said, like, could it be like the shifting gravimetric waves? And I was like, I'm glad you're saying it, because if it's an astrophysicist that say that, it makes sense. If it's me who don't know anything about it, it seems like a guess in the dark. What I think this experiment does is really like, aside from the technical feats of doing this and be able to pull it off and get it to like this kind of data, which were totally unexpected. But the fact that we are able to see the forest in its almost true behavior, because here we didn't insert a signal. We didn't inject the trees and see, which is what is being done before, which is amazing work, obviously. You like Susan Simard works and other have injected a signal that they know which one it is. And then you see how it moves through the system, and you can show that the system is wide and connected and interrelated. But in this case, this is what happens simply by being. So this is one example of what will be happening in these systems all the time, because they don't just respond to an eclipse, they respond to all sorts of things, of course. And we are so naively blind, because like we don't know. We're just seeing these beings and we keep judging them as like, they're just sitting there, rooted there, and they don't do anything, they don't move. And it's like, oh, there is so much stuff going on inside and within the system.
There are two related things that come from this to me, which is how limited our current human perception is. And by the way, everything in our world is aimed at limiting it more. I mean, the modern technology, the iPhones that are designed in social media that's designed to completely capture our attention, narrow our attention, really with the goal ultimately of making us consumers versus actually seeing the tremendous rising sense of insecurity and isolation we're seeing in the world. But what you're describing is if you can dissolve that, the sense of self that all these things are focused at, then we're actually at home in a deeply supportive, relational, wise, knowing, conscious web of life.
Well, I'm going to share something that happened during this experiment in the Dolomites. My colleague who set up the system, the physicist that set up the system, had already started when I arrived. This was immediately after COVID, so you can imagine it was the first time that we could go in the field again. It was very exciting. And it's something of a habit that I have. Is like whenever I start a new experiment or new field work, or when I go to a new place, I offer something to kind of like, I don't want to barge in a place. I just want to say, hello, I'm here, and can I be welcomed? Or am I welcomed here? And so, of course, I approached this forest by offering tobacco, because this is what I was taught in the tradition that I'm comfortable and a little bit more experienced with from South America. But I know there is an attitude that is expressed in other situations from other indigenous cultures. Introduce yourself and like, don't be rude, and like introduce yourself and ask permission to enter. So I offered tobacco, and I asked if I was welcome there, and the forest responded immediately, and it was like, you are welcome. It's clear now, I didn't understand at the time. And the message that I heard was like, but the story to be told is not what you think. And I was like, what does that mean? It's like, it's a bit cryptic. And of course, the experiment that we were setting up was a different experiment. So I didn't realize what the forest was talking about until, of course, in hindsight, when it's like, oh my God, the forest already told me, like, you're not here for what you think you're doing. And at the end of the experiment, so once everything unfolded, the eclipse happened, we had the date and everything. And so it was the last trip, basically. And we finished that field season, and I went to, up in the forest. And I just, at this point, again, I wanted to offer tobacco, but also to say thank you and goodbye. We're going now. Thank you so much. And as I sat there, I had a very strong experience. Many would probably define a mystical experience, but to me, it's like a natural experience. So when you connect with the world. And the forest gave me a message, which was, again, very cryptic, but also clear. And it was like, because I was looking out and I was feeling very overwhelmed by the idea of the state of the world and how can we destroy this? How can we destroy all this beauty? How can we be so blind and not care? And, that kind of mood. And the forest was like, or the land, I should say, where this forest is, was like, don't be sad. Don't be sad. The seeds that are, that are creating the dream of this place are intact. And over time, they will just come back. Don't worry about it. And I was like, okay. But, I didn't really understand it. Until a few days later, I was talking to one of my colleagues and also one of the rangers. And these are two separate events which actually explain to me what it is that I received from when that forest spoke that way. The ranger said to me, like totally unrelated, or so it seemed, the ranger said, it's amazing. We are seeing these new species of plants, just like, imagine we never planted them, but they're actually perfect for this place. And you have to know that the forest, in inverted comma, that we worked with was actually a monoculture. It's a monoculture of spruce that has been planted there for the last 1,000 years by the community there. So it's got a long history, but from the earth perspective, it's like, yeah. I let you play with this. Now it's time, to clean up the room and put the toys back in order. And so the species that were starting to emerge, the pines that have been the monoculture for a long time, they are dying. climate change, pest, all sorts of things. But the plants that are actually emerging, so the species of trees that are emerging are all species that are perfectly adapted for the land, and they are perfectly adapted for the climate that is coming. So it was like, and the ranger was telling me like this as like, isn't it cool? And I was thinking, oh my God, that's exactly what the forest or the land was telling me about, is the seeds of the forest that is really the dream here. It's intact and it will come back, don't worry. And he's like, it's already coming back. And then another colleague of mine, when I shared this with him, he said to me, oh, Monica, I need to give you this book. And he gave me this book from old fairy tales and folk story from that region. And in that book, there are 2 lines that someone must have wrote probably 1,000 years ago. It's basically telling the same. It's like the line says 9 times it will be woodland, 9 times it will be a prairie, and then it will return to what it was. And I was like, this to me is scientific replicability. It's just that the time scale is very big. So here is the collaboration from the land herself that obviously at some point told someone similar to me, oh, don't worry about it, it all will return. Then there is chaos and entropy happening. And then the system returned to its own state, its non-stable state. But to get there, it needs to do all of these changes. It needs to move all of this energy. And I think that's what we were observing. And that's what the ranger was seeing, like, oh, these species are coming up. We never planted them, but they're perfect. And they're going to be the ones that is not monoculture anymore. This is going to be the one that is creating the new biodiversity that is going to sustain life here. So it's so smart and it's so incredible to me that it feels like, you dare tell me that this is not an intelligent system, that there is not someone here that knows what's going on, that is got her own agenda, and she's looking after things. It gives me hope as well. So maybe at this time it's not bad.
So Janine Benyus says that life creates the conditions conducive to life.
Mm-hmm.
And what you were seeing there is life. Because of climate change, those forests are dying. The forests that were speaking to you knew that they were dying because there was an infestation of beetle bark eating trees that were destroying the trees that was coming closer and closer. And we know the trees have a sensing system about that. So they knew they were actually facing death.
Yep.
When they were telling you, don't worry, we're not worried. And they saw that this new life was emerging.
That's right.
And that is this extraordinary capacity of life to create the conditions conducive to life.
That's right. And as we know, like for young plants, lots of nutrients are required. But if you have all of these trees dying, and the beetle, the role of that beetle as well is to start breaking the wood down. And then the mushroom will come, and there are we saw lots of myceliums there, but the mushroom will come and then just start breaking down further and returning it, this is entropy, returning the energy into the system so that it can be stabilized again in a new form. And the new form is not the one that we imposed as humans, as a monoculture. The new form is the one that belongs there, which the land herself, this planet, decides, this is what looks good there. This is what is going to work there for the good of the whole, not just one species. So that I find amazing.
So we should end here, residing in hope and really residing in the sense of the energy, the intelligence, the consciousness that is underlying all of life that we see emerging through nature if we can quiet our subjective siloing selves to see the whole.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much for taking us through this journey of your work and this journey through the nature of nature.
Thank you. It was great to have a conversation.
Thank you to our guest, Monica Gagliano. The Common Good is a production of the Garrison Institute and is hosted by me, Jonathan F.P. Rose. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the podcast. Please send us a note at podcasts@garrisoninstitute.org and let us know what you think. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts. This show is produced by the Garrison Institute with production and marketing from The Podglomerate. Its theme music was composed by Jonathan F.P. Rose and performed by Jog Blues. We look forward to being with you again soon.